Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Don K. Preston, waiting on William Bell. He evidently got himself an Apple computer, a Mac, and he's trying to figure out the audio settings on it. Before we came on the air, he was asking me, he said, well, how do I adjust my audio settings on this Mac? And I didn't have much of an answer for him because I don't use a Mac very often at all. I use a Mac in the production of my YouTube videos of a morning. And beyond that, I honestly do not use a Mac very much. But he said he'd be on the standby. But in the meantime, we want to welcome everyone to Two Guys and a Bible, a voice you can trust, right here on Fulfilled Radio. And, pardon me, we're going to be discussing, continuing our critique of the lectures that were presented at the Bellview Church of Christ Lectures in Sausalito, Florida, earlier this year. I believe it was in June of this year, if I be not mistaken. And what the situation is, folks, you have to understand the mindset and the mentality of the men that were on the dais. They really believe that they are the only ones that have the truth. They are the exclusive purveyors and defenders of the truth. That if you disagree with them on almost any issue, then you're a false teacher, you're a heretic, you are more than likely doomed to an eternal hell. And their lectureship theme this year, pardon me, was refuting realized eschatology. And William and I have been critiquing speech after speech after speech. And the thing that has become extremely apparent as William and I have listened to these presentations, and I must say there have been some of those presentations that I have gone back over, listened to up to 3 times just to make sure that I was actually hearing what I thought I was hearing. And the reason for that is because I was so astounded at how bad the presentation was. And since I felt it was so bad, I really certainly did not want to misrepresent what I was going to claim the person said. William, I can hear you piddling around on that machine. But anyway, tonight we're going to critique, if we can get William in here, we're going to critique the post by a gentleman by the name of Doug Post. His topic was a review or a discussion of the resurrection out of the dead body of Judaism doctrine. And in reality, what Doug Post was supposed to be doing was an exegesis of 1 Corinthians 15, an exegesis of the doctrine of the resurrection. And as I was sharing with William earlier today, it was...
Hello, this is William. How are you doing?
Hey there. Are you with us now, William?
Yeah, well, it's not. This is not a new one.
I just haven't figured out where the audio settings are for
Skype.
I
got you.
Because I don't use
well,
it.
I was just sharing with the audience that as I listened to Doug Post, that it was actually just downright painful to listen to a man who really did not speak so much as he did read.
At the top, right.
I'm sorry, say again?
Yeah, yes.
William, are you speaking to me or someone else?
Okay. Yeah, that's making sense now. I'm so not trained to look in that area on the PC.
I believe that William is trying to speak to a tech about his Apple computer,
audio,
and we're getting
video.
We're getting the feedback here on Skype. So hopefully he'll join us here momentarily after he thinks he's got that.
I guess Don can hear me. It appears, unless he's hearing me through your phone.
I can hear you through your phone. I can hear you quite well, William. Are you there with us, William? Well, evidently not. Anyway, folks, I'll do my best to continue, even though William is trying to converse with someone there about his Macintosh computer. But as I listened to the presentation by Doug Post, I was struck by the fact that it was more than obvious with him, as it was with the huge majority of the speakers on that lectureship, that they absolutely had not spent any serious time reading preterist literature. Doug Post only supposedly referenced one preterist author. I am convinced he misrepresented him. I cannot believe that a preterist writer conversant at all with covenant eschatology would say what Doug Post ascribed to him. It's certainly possible that Doug Post misunderstood what had been said. If he did not misunderstand, and if the gentleman did not intend to say what Doug Post ascribed to him, then it's a horrible, horrible misrepresentation. So, pardon me, with all of that said, in the presentation, Doug Post said that he believed he was going to rename realized eschatology to redefinition eschatology, or something to that effect. He claimed that those of us who are preterists redefine all of the terms of the Bible. But something that really stuck out to me, was he kept saying they redefined the traditional definitions. Well, in a sense, that's right. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. It is traditional, pardon me, to define world in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3 in the King James Version as the end of the physical cosmos, the physical world. Now, that's quote, traditional definition. But preterists, and not simply preterists, by the way, folks, but linguistic experts have been pointing out for many, many, many years that the word that is translated as world in the good old King James is not world at all. It is the Greek word aeon, which means age. So here's a case in which preterists, quote, redefine the traditional definition. That's right, we do. But in redefining that, quote, traditional definition, unquote, we are actually getting back to the biblical truth. We're not distorting. We're not perverting anything. We're not misdefining anything. We are restoring the proper definition of the biblical words. Now, surely Mr. Post understands that there are words used in the New Testament, translated words, that meant one thing in the world of the King James translators, that means something totally different in the original Greek. In the modern world, in the modern vernacular, mean something different as well. And what they properly mean for us today is closer to the biblical text than the good old traditional definition. So, on the one hand, I take umbrage at what Mr. Post was claiming when he claimed that preterists redefine terms. We do not just arbitrarily and we do not capriciously set about defining words, and we do not do so without lexical justification at all. He claimed that we use the word body and the word flesh in non-traditional ways. Well, again, guess what? The word flesh, in Paul's terminology, did not always, in fact, it fairly seldom, referred to the human body of flesh. So when preterists come along, and by the way, not just preterists, but an increasing number of scholars, recognize that Paul is using the word flesh in a sense that has nothing to do with the biological substance of a human being. It has to do with a way of life. It has to do with a life opposed to God. Again, it is not biological substance. We might say, as has been pointed out by some, it has to do with stance before God as opposed to substance. So, let me reiterate. When Doug Post comes along and says, these preterists redefine traditional terms, well, yeah, in one sense we do. Because we redefine flesh in such a way as to say, it's not biological substance. That's not how Paul uses it. Because he says, for instance, in Romans chapter 8, you are not of the flesh. Oh, really? So we're supposed to believe that Paul was writing to a bunch of Casper ghosts, of people who were not in biological fleshly bodies? Folks, you know better than that. That becomes silly. Well, so here we preterists come along and we redefine the traditional terms. Flesh is not biological substance. It's a way of life opposed to God. Now, is that doing violence to the text? I dare say Doug Post would say, well, obviously in Romans chapter 8, we have to see that the word flesh is not biological substance. Okay, then thank you very much. You've joined the preterists in redefining traditional terms. And it's not wrong. It is rather necessary. So, again, I take a great deal of umbrage, on the one hand, to Doug Post just claiming that preterists arbitrarily redefine terms, and we do so in some unjustified sense, because that is absolutely not true at all. William, have you joined us yet? Okay. Well, one of the things that struck me, folks, about Doug Post in his presentation was, at the 6.5 minute mark, he made a comment, something to this effect. You have to understand what these people do. Now, I'm paraphrasing roughly. This is not intended to be any kind of a verbatim quote, but it gets the gist of what he was getting at. He said, you know, these realized eschatology folks, he said, they come along and they say, Paul preached nothing but the hope of Israel. And as I sat and listened to that, I said, yes, that is exactly what we say. The question is, what's wrong with that? After all, Paul said, when he was speaking of the resurrection, he said, this I confess, that after the way that they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, saying no other things. Now watch this, no other things than what Moses and the prophets said, that there is about to be a resurrection of the just and the unjust. So, yes, Doug Post, you're correct. Preterists do insist that when Paul discusses the resurrection of the dead, he is emphatic that he preached no other things than what Moses and the prophets said would take place. And furthermore, in Acts 26, 21 and following, Paul said, and now having obtained help from God, I witness to both small and great, saying no other things than what Moses and the prophets said should occur, that Christ would be the first to be raised from the dead, and that he should preach life and light to the Gentiles. So, yes, Doug Post, I freely, willingly, wonderfully, I might add, admit that I emphasize that Paul said he preached in his resurrection doctrine, in his eschatology, in other words, he preached nothing but the hope of Israel. Now, here's what's amazing, ladies and gentlemen. You really have to catch the power of this. Doug Post was ridiculing preterists for saying that, for taking that position, obviously ridiculing us for taking that position. But did Doug Post offer even a syllable of refutation of that biblical position? No. Not so much as a single word of an attempt to explain how Paul could say that he preached nothing but the hope of Israel found in Moses' law and the prophets, and yet we're supposed to believe that the resurrection occurs at the end of the Christian age in fulfillment of God's promises to the church and not to Israel. Not a word. I mean, literally not one word, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, this is stunning. And so here you have a guy that's supposed to be refuting covenant eschatology, and he points out one of the fundamental aspects of covenant eschatology, and he says, you have to understand how important this is to these people. And I'm sitting there going, that's right. It's that important. Do you have something to refute it? What do you have to say to refute it? And he doesn't say a word. William, I can hear you in the background now. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, wow.
Thanks
very
to
good.
Brother Billy Williams. He was able to get me all squared away.
There you go. Now, that Billy Williams is an Apple Macintosh guru. He is very, very good. Appreciate that help very, very much, Billy Williams. Well, William, I'm sure you heard what I was just sharing there about how Doug Post criticized, basically ridiculed, preterists for saying that Paul's eschatology, his doctrine of the resurrection, was nothing but the hope of Israel. And yet he offered not one single word, literally not one word, to explain that there's a problem with that. Now, it seems to me, William, if you're going to ridicule somebody for holding a position, and if you're going to point at, if you're in the process of trying to refute the theology of the people who hold that fundamental tenet, it seems to me like you really ought to offer at least some kind of refutation, at least a little bit of evidence, at least some kind of an argument. And yet, he did not offer a single word.
Yeah, you would think
it
that
just shows the weak.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you would think that he would. And my question would be, if it's not the resurrection, or if resurrection is not the hope of Israel, then whose hope was it?
Well, and you and I both know that in the traditional view of the men on the dais there at the Bellview lectureship, they believe that resurrection is a promise that was made to the New Covenant Church after God was through with Israel. It's a New Covenant promise. It's not an Old Covenant promise. I mean, it's how we were raised. I'm not impugning dishonesty to anyone that believes that. I know there are a lot of people in the all-millennial world that still believe that God was through with Israel at the cross, and that starting on Pentecost, God gave a whole new set of promises. I could give quotes to you from prominent all-millennialists as well as prominent post-millennialists who say that God was in fact through with Israel at the cross, that when we want to know about Christ and the second coming, when we want to know about eschatology, we do not go to the Old Testament. We go strictly to the New Testament. Lorraine Bettner, very, very prominent post-millennialist, took that position. Kim Riddlebarger took that position, or takes that position on eschatology, that we don't, all of God's promises to Israel were fulfilled by the time of the cross. And we don't go to the Old Testament. We don't go to the promises made to Israel for eschatology. We go strictly and solely to the New Testament. So again, I understand that's a popularly held view. I once held that view myself. But I will remember the point of time in which the sky fell on me when I read Matthew 24:14 and following, and Paul's statement over and over and over in the book of Acts and in Corinthians, how, guess what? He was expecting the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel at the time of the resurrection. And like I said, the sky fell on me, and it's like, uh-oh, I've got a huge problem here. and generally speaking, when amillennialists or postmillennialists see the full power of that reality, the sky falls on them as well. Now, there are varying responses to that, obviously. Some of them say, well, I just can't accept that, and they go on and maintain their quote, creedal views, their traditional views. Others say, well, I'm going to have to rethink that. William, another thing that Doug Post said in his presentation, there were several things that he said that were really quite staggeringly bad. But he said, another thing that you have to understand about these realized eschatologists, or these redefinition eschatologists, again, to use his pejorative term, is, as he discussed this other critical thing that that people have to understand about us. He said, they're very quick to point out. He said, they're very quick to point out how those Old Testament prophecies of the resurrection that Paul quotes, there's not one single one of them that actually predicts the coming of a physical body out of a hole in the ground. And he said, so they make the argument, Paul's doctrine of the resurrection was from the Old Testament. Not one of those Old Testament prophecies predicted physical bodies coming out of the hole in the ground. Therefore, that's not what resurrection is in the New Testament. And once again, I sat there and I said, well, you're exactly right. None of those Old Testament prophecies that serve as the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine, none of them predicted the raising of decomposed human corpses out of a hole in the ground. Therefore, since those prophecies are the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine, in 1 Corinthians 15, then 1 Corinthians 15 is not about the raising of decomposed biological bodies out of a hole in the ground. And so I'm sitting there going, okay, Doug Post, you're telling people this is the preterist argument. Where is your counter-argument? Where is your refutation? And once again, he didn't give it. Now, I'm fairly certain, to try to be generous here, I'm fairly certain that he felt like his exposition and his exegesis was to be the answer to that. But it wasn't. William, one of the arguments that he made was, well, what we have is the physical resurrection of Jesus, which is proven in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 and following. William, do you and I know of any preterists that deny that?
I certainly don't. I've never heard a preterist deny.
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus' resurrection was taught in 1 Corinthians 15.
Okay. So he argued from that, the resurrection of the rest of the dead has to be of the same nature as the resurrection of Jesus. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, William. I'm going to play the Doug Post advocate and say, okay, look, preterist, Jesus was raised from the dead physically, biologically. You admit that. And the resurrection, he was the first fruit, and the harvest is supposed to follow the first fruit. Therefore, the resurrection and the harvest has to be of dead bodies coming out of holes in the ground. So how do you respond to that, Mr. Preterist?
Well, first of all, when you look at the resurrection of Christ, the text says Christ was the first fruits, and actually, more literally, it says he is the first of the first fruits. Anyone familiar with the feast days in Leviticus 23 would understand that there were two separate times for the receiving of the first fruits. And not only were there two separate times, but the first fruits, as you and I discussed earlier, one was the barley harvest. And then the harvest that was 50 days later was the wheat harvest. And so here you have barley at one time, wheat at another. But they're both called first fruits. But it shows you that there is somewhat of a distinction between the resurrection of Christ and the first fruits. And yet there is solidarity between them as well, because one is connected to the other. One is not without the other. It is the first of the first fruits that becomes the pledge of the entire harvest, not only of the wheat harvest, but also of the harvest at the end of the growing season. And in terms of resurrection, it would be the harvest at the end of the age. So there was a solidarity between all of them. And at the same time, there is a difference between them in certain ways. You had the the barley harvest, you had the wheat harvest. And then when you look at the end of the age harvest, or look at the end of the harvest season, that was altogether somewhat different as well, because that was the harvest of the fruit and the things that grew on the trees, etc. So yet all of them were a part of that one process. So that would be one way I would address it. The other way, of course, would be, no matter what you made of them, the actual term that is used for the first fruits is a term that indicates imminence. In other words, that with the resurrection of Christ, the actual harvest has begun. And in the paradigm of Doug Post and the futurists, they don't have a position that states that the resurrection has already begun. So I'll leave it at that for the moment. I'm sure you might have some things you want to enhance that with.
Well, I was just sitting here thinking, William, as you pointed out, the undeniable truth that in Leviticus chapter 23, you had the first of the first fruit of the first fruit, and that was barley. Then you had the first fruit of the harvest, and that corresponds to Pentecost. So you have the first fruit of the first fruit, which is barley. Then you have the first fruit, which is Pentecost, of first fruit of wheat. Then you have the harvest at the end of the age, as you pointed out. Well, here's the tragedy. You and I can both relate extremely well to the mentality that was present at the Bellview Church of Christ lectures. If I were a betting man, I would say, and I don't want to be unkind at all, but I'm speaking from my knowledge of being a fifth-generation member of the Churches of Christ, raised in and around some of the most prominent preachers in the Churches of Christ. There were none of the men that I admired the most in the Churches of Christ that ever had a single inkling, that had the slightest clue about the significance, the role of Israel's festal calendar in eschatology. I mean, not so much as of a hint of a clue. And yet, the feast days are really the Rosetta Stone of biblical eschatology. Now, certainly, many of the prominent ministers would refer to Pentecost. Oh, look at this. This is the Feast of First Fruit. And, oh, look at this. Christ is our Passover, and he died on Passover. So in that regard, yes, there were references to it. That is, to Israel's festal calendar. But never any lessons that gave the slightest hint of a clue, of a suggestion, of an idea that these men believed for even a moment that Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Sukkot, Feast of Harvest, Feast of Ingathering, had to be fulfilled to fulfill Israel's festal calendar, certainly for the law to pass away. Because, pardon me, they were so locked into the mentality that God was through with Israel at the cross. The law passed away at the cross. Well, they could not say the law passed away at the cross and at the same time say, well, we're waiting on the final 3 feast days of Israel to be fulfilled. They couldn't even fathom that concept. So when we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, what do we find? Christ is the first fruit of the first fruit. Okay? They don't even have a concept of that. I don't remember a single minister ever developing that. Period. But that is a biblical fact. As you pointed out, it's in the text. Point number 2. Even though they say Christ was the first fruit of the resurrection, as you so very well pointed out there a moment ago, William, they never acknowledged that that meant that the resurrection had begun, that the harvest was imminent. You know, to suggest to a Jew, in the imagery that Paul is using, that, okay, the first fruits had taken place, but, the harvest won't be for a couple of thousand, maybe 1 million years yet. What a ridiculous idea. Imminence is contained in the very terminology of first fruits. Oh, my goodness. That was my phone going off, obviously. So, well, I apologize for that. Undoubtedly another solicitor. But anyway, they even though they might point out, as they do, Christ was the first fruit, even as Doug Post said, yeah, he's the first fruit of the harvest. So again, to reiterate, they completely ignore the imminence factor in that. They also overlook the significance, the festal significance, the feast day significance. That if Christ's resurrection was the first fruit of the first fruit, thus fulfilling Israel festal calendar typology, necessary for the law to pass away, then guess what? When it says, afterward Christ, those who are Christ at his coming, there's the harvest, which is the fulfillment of the Feast of Sukkot, the last feast in Israel's festal calendar. Now, if Christ, the first fruit of the first fruit, had to be raised from the dead to pass away, Pentecost,
You still here, Don? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Don just got cut off, and I'm sure he'll dial back in. That's just some of the technology issues that we have when we are doing these live broadcasts, but I'm sure he'll be back in. And of course, as he was talking about the first fruits and the first of the first fruits that are mentioned in Leviticus 23, which are part of those feast days, and definitely something that those who want to speak against covenant eschatology need to consider in their paradigms and in their arguments, because if they're not lining up their resurrection doctrine and rebuttals with what is taught concerning the feast days, they are not only failing to grasp the true and full meaning of resurrection, they're also failing to understand the whole scheme of eschatology, because it all works out on that theme. And when you start to see those feast days woven into the eschatology of the Bible, it's woven into every aspect of it. And that helps you to see more clearly what the resurrection is and what it was all about. And so on the day of Pentecost, this, of course, is corresponds to the wheat harvest in Leviticus chapter 23, which was, of course, the 7 Sabbaths, and on the morrow after the Sabbath was the day of Pentecost. Well, that's when the gospel was first preached, and that's when people first received deliverance or salvation. That's when it was initiated from their sins. They received the remission of sins, and so that was a coming out of death. And of course, as we've spoken before, the gospel was preached to Jews on the day of Pentecost, and actually to Jews only for some time thereafter. And of course, this is the conversion that was taking place. We're waiting for Don to come back in, so he should be back in shortly. Once he discovers that he's out, that's the first thing. And that's pretty much the way it is with anything. A person has to discover that they have the problem before they can fix the problem. And so he may be still talking, which normally, he does, because if you can't tell that your line has dropped, you're going to just continue on where you were until finally you get word, or you look up at your computer and you see that you are not online. So let me, while I'm waiting on him, I'll just shoot him a quick message and let him know if he can read Skype or see his messages on Skype. He will understand that he's that he's not on, but we'll try it at least. So, but that is as we were saying, that's the point of the first fruits, and the first of the first fruits that was taking place in the first century. And it's rather interesting that we don't have a first fruits that is disconnected to the time of the first century scenario. The first fruits is also taken in connection with the outpouring of the Spirit, because, in fact, it was said of them that they had received the first fruits of the Spirit. And that, again, serves to show the time and the nature of what was taking place in the first century. So when these gentlemen say to us that we are, teaching a resurrection that is separate and apart from the hope of Israel, or they claim that that is what we're teaching, as Don was saying earlier, what is the counter response to that? What do you have to offer in place of that when Paul makes that statement and is very, very clear that he taught no other doctrine than those things which Moses, and the prophets said would come, that there was about to be, according to the way he says, Acts 24, 14 and 15, which they call a sect. He said, "So I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." So the scripture is very clear when it asks the question, what advantage then, to what advantage did the Jew have, or what advantage has the Jew? And Paul said, much in every way, because to him chiefly was committed the oracles of God. So you're talking about the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, which God gave to them, and therefore it contained their hope. And that is what is being expressed, at least from its initial reception, starting then. I think Dunn has come back in, so let's see if we can get him connected here. All right, and ladies and gentlemen, he should be back online at any moment now. I think he's in. Well, he just got cut out again, so I'm not sure what's happening with his connection tonight, and we're just having quite a few. He's back. Okay, he's got fast fingers. I must maybe hit the redial button, so he's back again. Let's see if we...
No, William, what happened? I was just, talking right along there, and all of a sudden it came up and says Skype has stopped working. Do you want to close the program? It would not, obviously, let me continue. So I thought, well, I'll back out of it. But when I backed out of it, I lost Skype, had to reboot my computer. So that's... I really don't know what happened on that, just like last week. I don't know if there's an interface problem with my Pamela. My Pamela records the programs, and I'm beginning to wonder if maybe I need to go in and set a different time, recording time, for Pamela, because what seems to be the case is that I get to a certain point in the program, just about the same point last week, and all of a sudden it kicks me off. So I apologize for that, folks. Really, really sorry about that.
Well, that used to happen to me all the time back when we were first doing the show. Yes. So just the wonders of technology, as they say.
There you go. Hopefully it won't keep doing that. So where were we, William?
Well, you were just about to, you were developing the first fruits from the standpoint of Pentecost.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, the point that I was making is that it's interesting that historically in the churches of Christ and in the amillennial world as a whole, what they do is they will admit the importance of Jesus fulfilling Passover, for instance. That had to take place in order to fulfill the law. Okay, that's fine. The day of Pentecost had to take place in order to fulfill the law. Pentecost was the day of first fruits. Okay, that's fine. But then all of a sudden, it's almost like they lose complete and total track, and they forget the fact that there were 3 more feast days that were eschatological in nature. The first 4 feast days were not truly eschatological in the genuine sense of it. That is, they were not related to judgment and resurrection. The point of it is, in 1 Corinthians 15, what do you have? Christ the first of the first fruits. Okay, that's in fulfillment of Israel's festal calendar. You have the first fruits. That's in fulfillment of Israel's festal calendar. But guess what? The harvest is the Feast of Sukkot in fulfillment of Israel's festal calendar. So the question that I posed, as I was clearly off the air, was that if Christ had to die and to be raised from the dead as the first of the first fruit in order for the law to pass, and if the day of the harvest, the day of Pentecost, had to take place to fulfill the law and for the law to pass, then why is the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Sukkot, why was it not necessary for it to be fulfilled, i.e. the harvest resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, why is it not necessary to be fulfilled for the law to pass away? These guys have some of the law passing when some of it is fulfilled, in direct violation of Jesus' words, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. They claim it was all fulfilled at the cross. Oh, well, wait a minute, not really all of it, because Pentecost has to be fulfilled. Yeah. Pentecost was the day of Pentecost. So, okay, now we got the first 4 feast days fulfilled. The law can pass away. That's not what Jesus said. Not what Jesus said at all. And so the almost schizophrenic nature of the amillennial view of the law, view of eschatology, was brought out extremely well by Doug Post in his references to 1 Corinthians 15, saying, well, okay, Christ is the first fruit. Now, William, he did something, and he made a comment about the significance of Christ the first fruits. He said the first fruits are the best of the harvest, totally ignoring that it's first, okay? That is, he laid no emphasis on it being first, but rather being the best. But is that where the emphasis lies in reference to the first fruit? Since it says Christ was the firstborn from the dead. So we have firstborn and we have first fruits. So is the emphasis on quality, or is it on quality and status, or is it on temporal occurrence, order of occurrence?
That's the question you're asking me?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, the term in the scriptures focuses on the order of occurrence because it's, you have both the idea that it's first, that it is the best, of course, the first. That was one of the concepts behind it, but it also carries the idea of order. And you have a text in 1 Corinthians 15 that emphasizes that. It uses a military term. I can't remember the actual Greek word there, but it's in the very text, verse 23, I believe it is, where
it's the Greek word. It's the Greek word tagma.
Tagma, okay. I know I've looked it up. I spoke on it years ago on the lectureship and pointed it out, and which is why I remember the term. But it's a military term, and it has to do with order and rank, and especially as it relates to to time. And so he's talking about Christ, the first fruits toward those who are Christ at his resurrection. That is the order of resurrection. That lays out precisely in the manner of the first fruits, because they were all separated in time. You didn't have the first of the first fruits taken at the same time as the first fruits, and nor did you have the first fruits in terms of their initiation starting at the same time of the completion of the harvest. That doesn't even compute the beginning of one equaling the end of the other. So you have this order going on in the New Testament as well as in the Old Testament with the feast days in the manner in which they're laid out. And again, as I was saying when Don was away, that's what is missing from the futurist paradigm of eschatology. They cannot pull it together so that they get this order in place, and they get it in terms of what Don was just saying, that it fulfills a part of the Old Covenant. And that's why in our debates, we've had this dichotomization of when the law is fulfilled, as he was just saying a moment ago. Some fulfill then, some fulfill later. And some of them, it will not be fulfilled until the alleged end of time. That's the dilemma that they're facing because they do not honor these concepts that we are sharing with them, and that are coming from the scriptures. And that's why Brother Post had no rebuttal other than to state what we believe, but he had no response in terms of how to refute it.
It's interesting to me, William, and you were there and heard this. So, some years ago in Alabama, I had a debate with Brother Thomas Thrasher, a Church of Christ preacher. And Thomas Thrasher got up in presentation after presentation. He had charts that he put up. Christ the first fruit, Christ the first fruit, Christ is the first fruit. And he had quotes from Bible dictionaries about first fruit means the first in order of occurrence, first in order of occurrence. And he would say first doesn't mean later, first doesn't mean last, and it doesn't mean second, it means first. And I'll never forget sitting there going, he really doesn't want to make that argument. And so I got up and I simply observed that Brother Thrasher kept saying Christ was the first to be raised from the dead. First fruit, and first fruit means first fruit. And he kept asking, what does first fruit mean anyway? And so I responded, first fruit means first. So I asked the question, was Jesus the first person to be raised from biological death? I pointed out that obviously he was not. He raised Lazarus from the dead himself. He raised Jairus' daughter from the dead himself. We go back into the Old Testament even, and Elijah raised some from the dead. Therefore, Brother Thrasher's argument had completely backfired on him because he was saying first meant first physically, and that was his emphasis over and over again. But Christ was not the first to be raised from the dead biologically. Therefore, the word first, therefore, cannot refer to physical resurrection. It must mean the first to be raised from the death of Adam. And Brother Thrasher got back up there and said, well, I didn't really mean that first meant first. I never will forget those moments in that debate. That wasn't the point that I was trying to make, which it obviously was the point that he was trying to make over and over and over again. And so he was caught in a blatant, fatal self-contradiction, and the only way that he saw to get out of it was to say, I didn't really mean what I said. I didn't really mean that first means first. Well, if first doesn't mean first, what does it mean? What does firstborn mean? What is first to be raised from the dead? By the way, that's exactly what Paul says in Acts 26:21. This is hugely problematic for Doug Post and his presentation because he alluded a couple of different times to Christ's first fruits. Okay, Brother Post. Acts 26:21 says that Moses and the prophets said Christ would be the first to be raised from the dead. First to be raised from the dead. He is the firstborn from or out from among the dead. He's the first to be raised. Paul emphasizes that in 1 Corinthians 15. As we've already noted, he's the firstborn of those who had fallen asleep. He is the first fruits of the first fruits. Every man in his own order. Christ, the first fruit. After those that are Christ, at his coming. That's the order of occurrence. It is not importance, although that certainly can't be denied. But it's not contained in the Greek word tagma, and it's certainly not the priority meaning there in 1 Corinthians 15, 23 and following, when it says every man in his own order. You have Christ, you have the first fruits. Afterward, those are Christ at his coming. So you have a very clear three-stage order of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Christ, first fruits, those who are Christ at his coming. Three-stage. That's order of occurrence, folks. And Doug Post, by agreeing and acknowledging that Christ was the first fruit of those who were raised from the dead, guess what? He just entrapped himself. Because here he is emphasizing the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. Turns right around and says Christ was the first fruit. Okay? Doug Post needs to answer the question. Was Christ the first fruit, the first person raised from biological death? He knows he wasn't. He could not answer that question without completely and totally destroying his own doctrine. It forces him. The reality of the doctrine of the first fruit, the reality of the doctrine of Jesus being the first to be raised from the dead, destroys Doug Post's argument that said, well, Jesus was raised physically from the dead. The resurrection has to be exactly like that. Okay, Doug Post, Jesus was the first to be raised from the dead. Jesus was raised biologically from the dead. We agree with that. But Paul said he was the first to be raised from the dead that he's looking at in his doctrine of the resurrection, but he was not the first to be raised from biological death. That means that Paul is referring to Christ's biological death as a sign and as the indication of a greater spiritual resurrection, because once again, you cannot argue that Christ was raised biologically and then argue he was the first to be raised from the dead, and everyone has to be raised exactly like him without entrapping yourself fatally, because Christ was not the first person to be raised from biological death, and that's all there is to it. There's no escape from that dilemma. I don't care how hard Doug Post might try. He can't escape that dilemma. If he demands that Christ's physical resurrection is the first fruit resurrection, then guess what? He's made the Bible out to be a liar. Because there were quite a few physical resurrections prior to Christ's physical resurrection. And yet, the resurrection that is the focus of Paul's resurrection doctrine in 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection out of which Christ was the first to be raised. Well, let me say again, that means that Christ's physical resurrection was pointing to something different from his physical resurrection. It was pointing to a resurrection of which Christ was the first to be raised. That's not physical. It means he was the first to be raised out of spiritual death, i.e. the death of Adam. There's no other way out of that. And William, it looks like to me we are out of time. So we want to thank everyone for joining us on tonight's program. I apologize for, again, the technical problems. I'm going to see if I can't get this worked out. Like I said, I think it has to do with my Pandora there, or my Pamela, or whatever that thing's called. And so I'll try to get that worked out so that it doesn't happen again. In the meantime, folks, again, let us say thanks to all of you who are joining up to be subscribers to Two Guys in a Bible, Fulfilled Radio. Thanks for joining us for this evening's program here on Two Guys in a Bible, a voice you can trust. Good night, and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Don Preston and myself, we'd like to say, have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.